25 December 1947. The force did not remember victories. It absorbed them. By the fourth morning, frost melted into mud beneath a sky the color of ash, and the ravine that had witnessed so much uncertainty returned to its quiet indifference. Birds resumed their cautious movement between branches. Smoke drifted lazily from distant artillery impacts, already becoming part of the landscape rather than a disruption of it. Yet among the German units reassigned to the sector, nothing felt neutral anymore. The land itself seemed compromised, no longer predictable, no longer obedient to doctrine. German after-action summaries from that week reflect a noticeable shift in tone. Words like hesitation, delayed advance, and unverified enemy capability appear with increasing frequency. These were not the terms of an army accustomed to momentum. They were the language of a force beginning to question its assumptions. The absence of sergeants had done more than weaken command. It had stripped confidence from the lowest levels of the structure. Corporals deferred decisions. Riflemen hesitated before stepping into open ground. Patrol leaders requested reinforcements where none were deemed necessary weeks earlier. And through this subtle paralysis moved Churchill, unchanged in posture, unchanged in method. He did not seek further kills that day. He did not need to. The transformation had already occurred. The bow, still slung across his shoulder, had done what battalions sometimes failed to do. It altered enemy behavior. This was the unspoken power of psychological warfare, rarely captured by maps or casualty counts. A battlefield could be won not only by pushing forward, but by forcing the enemy to slow down, to doubt, to misjudge time and space. The arrowhead in his pouch darkened, now with residue from repeated sharpening pressed against his side as he walked. It remained unused, yet its presence carried weight. It symbolized something deeper than lethality. It symbolized restraint, the ability to stop once the objective had been achieved. Where industrial war demanded constant output, more shells, more sorties, more noise, this quieter form of conflict valued precision over volume. The Allies, unlike the rigid hierarchies they opposed, permitted this kind of judgment. They trusted individuals to know when enough had been done. This trust was not accidental. It was rooted in ideology. British and Allied military culture, while far from perfect, allowed space for unconventional thinking. From improvised armor in North Africa to radar development during the Battle of Britain, innovation flourished not because of blind obedience, but because systems allowed deviation when necessity demanded it. Churchill's bow existed within this tradition. It was not an act of rebellion, but of alignment with a broader belief that effectiveness mattered more than appearance, and results mattered more than conformity. German doctrine, by contrast, had grown increasingly inflexible as the war progressed. The Wehrmacht prized discipline, but discipline hardened into rigidity. Orders flowed downward, rarely upward. Deviations were discouraged, improvisation viewed with suspicion. This system functioned efficiently under ideal conditions, but war rarely offers those. In the forested valley, the Germans confronted an enemy who refused to behave as their manuals predicted. And without the adaptability to respond creatively, their system strained. By late afternoon, German commanders withdrew patrols to more defensible ground. The valley, temporarily, belonged to uncertainty. British engineers took advantage of the pause, reinforcing positions, moving supplies, evacuating wounded. None of this would appear dramatic in post-war summaries, yet it was precisely these quiet margins of time that determined survival. And that time had been bought by silence, by arrows, by a man whose presence bent expectation. Churchill spent the evening maintaining his equipment. He cleaned the bowstring carefully, checking for fraying, rubbing it with wax. He inspected each arrow, ensuring the fletching remained true. These actions were not ritualistic. They were practical. Still, they carried symbolic resonance. In a war dominated by factories and mass production, here was a weapon requiring human attention, patience, and intimacy. Each arrow bore the mark of individual care, not assembly line uniformity. Nearby, British soldiers prepared rations simple tins, bread hardened by cold, tea brewed weak but steady. They ate quietly, glancing occasionally toward the forest edge, where darkness pooled between trees. Some found comfort in knowing that the silence beyond was not empty, but watched. Others found unease in it. War produces both reactions in equal measure. Yet beneath both was a growing recognition that this sector was no longer defenseless. German intelligence officers attempted to explain the disruption. Some hypothesized specialized British units equipped with experimental weapons. Others suspected sabotage or misinformation. None accurately identified the source. The idea that a single soldier with a bow could produce such effect did not fit within acceptable parameters. And so the truth remained obscured not by secrecy, but by disbelief. In the days that followed, German patrols resumed, but cautiously, deliberately. They avoided the ravine. They widened spacing to the point of inefficiency. They delayed movements until daylight. Each adjustment cost time, energy, momentum. These were not tactical defeats recorded in bold ink, but cumulative erosions that weakened the campaign inch by inch. Churchill's role gradually diminished as reinforcements arrived and the front stabilized. He was reassigned. The bow returned to his side more as companion than necessity. Yet the impact of those 3 days endured far longer than his presence. German soldiers continued to recount stories of the silent hunter in the woods. British troops carried the knowledge forward that unconventional skill could matter, that courage need not be loud, and that the modern battlefield still had room for ancient truths. Years later, historians would struggle to categorize the events. They would debate numbers, verify reports, question memory. 7 sergeants in 3 days would seem improbable, almost mythic. Yet the records remained. Casualty lists aligned. Patrol logs confirmed anomalies. And Churchill's service file noted his actions without embellishment, as if the war itself resisted turning him into legend. Perhaps that restraint was fitting, because the story was never about spectacle. It was about the quiet assertion of agency within chaos. It was about a man who refused to be reduced to a single way of fighting. It was about the freedom to choose one's tools, one's methods, one's path, even when the world insisted otherwise. And the arrowhead, small and easily overlooked, endured as the story's true constant. Not the bow, not the bodies, but the idea behind it. Precision over excess, judgment over obedience, humanity over machinery. The forest would eventually reclaim the valley. Moss would cover boot prints. Rust would eat away at abandoned helmets. But the lesson lingered, carried forward by those who understood that victory does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. By the time the front line finally shifted westward, the valley no longer appeared on situation maps as a point of concern. The German units once assigned to dominate had been redeployed, their commanders citing terrain instability and elevated risk for negligible gain. Such language, carefully neutral, concealed a deeper truth. The ground itself had become psychologically hostile. It resisted prediction. It defied routine. And armies that rely on certainty struggle when the land refuses to cooperate. Churchill departed the sector without ceremony. There were no commendations issued in the field, no immediate recognition beyond the quiet nods of officers who understood what had occurred but could not easily translate it into formal doctrine. The war pressed onward, indifferent to individual acts unless they scaled into strategy. Yet this was the paradox of the conflict. While grand movements reshaped continents, it was often the solitary figure operating in margins, unseen by headquarters, that altered the texture of the war itself. German units passing through the region weeks later still recorded anomalies. Patrols moved faster than necessary, avoided wooded depressions, and kept watch for threats that no longer existed. This residual caution revealed the lasting nature of the transformation. The bow was gone, the man had moved on, yet expectation had been permanently altered. What had once been mocked as primitive now lingered as possibility. The enemy had learned, unwillingly that superiority was conditional. Post-war analysis would frame this episode not as a turning point, but as an illustration. Military journals examining psychological warfare noted how unpredictability could outperform brute force in limited engagements. One British after-action review observed that enemy hesitation exceeded proportional response, a clinical phrase masking the reality that fear, once introduced, rarely dissipates cleanly. It migrates. It infects judgment. It slows momentum. In this case, that fear had been delivered not by technology, but by skill unburdened by doctrine. The arrowhead remained with Churchill long after the bow was packed away. It traveled with him through subsequent operations, across borders and seasons, accumulating scratches and dulling slightly at the edges. It never again drew blood, but it did not need to. Its purpose had evolved. It became a private emblem of something learned and proven, that an individual trusted with autonomy could impose order on chaos without requiring permission from systems larger than himself. This was the deeper ideological shift the episode revealed. The German military, structured around obedience and predictability, had no space for such deviation. Initiative flowed downward only. Innovation required authorization. The Allied approach imperfect and inconsistent, though it often was left room for human judgment. That space, small as it might appear on paper, allowed imagination to enter the battlefield. It allowed a bow to exist beside rifles, and for silence to become a weapon equal to noise. As the war drew closer to its end, stories like this rarely entered public consciousness. They were too quiet, too localized, too resistant to spectacle. Yet historians later recognized their cumulative weight. Victory was not forged solely in factories or decided by generals. It was also assembled from countless moments where individuals acted freely within the bounds of shared purpose, where democracy expressed itself not only through governance, but through trust. In the years that followed, Europe rebuilt itself layer by layer. Forests regrew. Fields were replanted. The ravine filled with leaves and water, erasing the evidence of conflict. Children walked past once crossed by soldiers, unaware of the fear that had once shaped every step there. But history, though buried, does not vanish. It settles. It waits. The arrowhead, preserved and carried forward, became a metaphor for that persistence. Small, unassuming, easily dismissed, yet capable, in the right hands, of reshaping reality. It reminded those who understood its story that freedom is not maintained by scale alone. It endures because individuals are permitted, sometimes encouraged, to think, to adapt, and to act beyond expectation. War is often remembered through its loudest moments. Yet beneath the thunder of artillery and the roar of engines lies another record, quieter but no less true. It is written in pauses, in hesitation, in the sudden absence of certainty. It is written by those who refuse to conform when conformity fails. In that forest, over 3 winter days. A man with a bow demonstrated that modern war had not erased the value of ancient skills, nor the power of human agency. He proved that even amid industrial devastation, the human spirit could choose precision over excess, thought over reflex, and freedom over fear. And long after the last patrol moved on, after the final shot echoed in the silence, the meaning remained etched not into monuments or medals, but into understanding itself. That victory is not always forged in noise. Sometimes it arrives on the whisper of a bowstring and changes everything long after the war ended, long after uniforms were folded away and equipment cataloged into museums. The lesson of that forest resisted easy classification. It did not belong to any single doctrine, nor could it be reduced to a training manual. It existed instead as a reminder, quiet, persistent, that history often pivots on moments that never announced themselves. In the decades that followed, militaries around the world studied adaptability with renewed seriousness. Analysts spoke of decentralized command, of empowering small units, of cultivating initiative under pressure. These concepts were framed in modern language, supported by statistics and simulations, yet their essence echoed something far older. They echoed the understanding that had guided one man through trees and shadow. That war, stripped of ideology and machinery, still bends to human choice. The German army that emerged from the conflict was no longer the force that had entered it. Its mythology of inevitability had been shattered not only by defeat, but by countless experiences where certainty collapsed at the smallest scale. Encounters like the one in that valley were rarely cited directly, yet they lived on in institutional memory as cautionary absence, the realization that control, once believed absolute, had always been fragile. For the Allies, the war reinforced a different conviction, that abundance did not merely mean more tanks or aircraft, but more latitude, more room for individuals to apply judgment, more tolerance for the unconventional. The arrowhead, carried quietly through the campaign, symbolized that abundance in its purest form. It required no factory, no fuel convoy, no bureaucracy. Only trust, skill, and the freedom to act. Churchill himself returned to civilian life without fanfare. Like many who had served in obscurity, he spoke little of his actions. The bow was stored away. The arrowhead remained, kept not as a trophy, but as a reminder of restraint. He understood something that war teaches unevenly, that power exercised sparingly often lasts longer than power displayed. When later generations asked how victory had been achieved, the answers tended toward scale armies, alliances, production figures. These explanations were not wrong, but they were incomplete. They left out the quiet margins where outcomes were softened, delayed, or redirected by individuals operating beyond expectation. They left out the spaces where ideology manifested not in speeches, but in permission. Freedom, after all, is not only defended by strength, it is sustained by trust. Trust that a person, given responsibility, will rise to it. Trust that innovation can come from anywhere. Trust that silence can be as effective as noise. In that forest, the war briefly revealed its true dimensions. Not just a clash of nations, but a contest between rigidity and adaptability. Between systems that demanded obedience and those that allowed thought. The arrowhead did not win the war, but it illuminated why one side ultimately could, and so the story endures not as legend, but as understanding. That even in the most mechanized conflict in human history, the outcome still depended on the oldest constant of all, the individual mind, free to choose its path. When the world listens only for thunder, it risks missing the quieter forces that shape it. History is not moved solely by what is loud and visible. Sometimes it turns on what moves unseen, leaves no trace, and vanishes back into the trees.